Good evening and welcome to the shiur. This is Sunday of Parshas Bamidbor. Let's go straight into our questions. So the first question someone asked me is, you notice that if you're not able to daven with a minyan, there is encouragement to daven at the same time as the minyan. There is a value of, if you can't get to the minyan, but to daven in the Shul where people daven. So now he's got this dilemma where it's either one or the other. He won't be able to daven in Shul with a minyan. He can either daven at home earlier at the same time, or as a minyan, or he can daven in Shul later without the minyan. So he's asking which is priority. So let's read the Halocho in Shulchan Aruch. This is in Siman Tzadik. So first of all, the value of just getting these points in place. The imhu onus she'ena yochel, having discussed the virtue of praying in Shul, then he said with a tzibur, with the congregation, if a person is unable to get to this Shul, that's his feeling feeble. It's not necessarily on the level of bedridden, but he's not feeling so energetic. And he's not capable of getting a minyan together at home. Then he should try to zone in to pray at the same time when the congregation are praying b'beis haknesses. So you're davening at home because you don't have the energy to go to Shul, but try to daven, it means particularly Shemona Esrei, try to kind of synchronize that you should be davening at the same time as the minyan and the congregation in Shul. Shehi eis rotzon, because that's an auspicious time. Ve'ein tefilosoi nidches, and your tefillah, your prayer will not be rejected. It's not the same as davening in Shul, but the fact that you are synchronized, you are davening at the same time as the tzibur, your tefillah, your prayer won't be rejected, although it's not at the same level as davening in the Shul. So that's one value of davening at the same time as the minyan is davening in Shul. Then we have a second value. Someone who's local and he didn't manage to get to Shul. He's davening on his own, and the tzibur have davened already. He should still endeavor to daven in Shul, because this is the location which is designated for communal prayer. And the person's prayer is listened to when it's said in this holy location, as was discussed earlier. Plus, there's a godly presence in the Shul. God is present in the godly congregation. He takes the word Eid Adas as in Moyed, the meeting place where in a meeting to daven, the Shechina is there. So now, looking at these two expressions, that the Shul is a Eis Rotzon and your tefillah is not, you're davening at the same time, Eis Rotzon, your tefillah isn't rejected. Here he says, if you're davening in a Shul, your tefillah is heard. I somehow feel that the language used for davening, the value of davening in Shul is more powerful. His tefillah is listened to, not just his tefillah isn't rejected, his tefillah is listened to. So I'm more inclined to say that davening in Shul at a later point is more valuable than davening at home at the same time as the minyan. However, in the Piskei Teshuvos, he quotes Reb Shlomo Zalman, who says the opposite. He says here, well, let's start over here. He says there is the importance of davening at the same time as the minyan. That's not a justification to skip parts of davening to be able to catch up with the minyan wherever they may be. But then he says that davening at the same time as the minyan is greater than davening in the shul on your own. And therefore, he says it's preferable to pray at home at the time of the shul rather than to daven in the shul on your own when there's no congregation. Now, this is Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. It is. I checked it up. There's something called halichos shleima. These are like what we in Lubavitch language would call hanocha bilti muga or something, of Talmidim who heard things from him. He doesn't bring any proofs there, and so all right. As I say, I'm more inclined the other way around. But whichever way you do, both of them have got a value. Yeah. Okay. Let's move on. Number 2. Okay. So here's something. As you may know, I had a grandson born last Sunday. The bris was meant to have been today. It didn't happen because the baby was jaundiced, but Bez Hashem, it'll be Bismane. Whenever it's going to be Bismane. But meanwhile, I've been working on a manuscript written about. It was written about 1860. In that region, 68, 1880. That's when it was written. And it's a collection. It's about 400 pages of collated from different foreign sources, comments, explanations about tefillah. So, because of the bris, in the imminent bris, I selected from the manuscript the following. So there was someone by the name of Shalshavsky, who was this Yudel Shalshavsky was he taught Talmud in a seminar which was under the Maskilim, the Enlightenment. I'm not sure whether it's Kovna or someone in the litter. And he challenged the expression which we have at a bris, where we say, we designate the chair, we say, Zeh HaKiseh shel Eliyohu haNovi zachur l'tov, and then we say, Eliyohu malach habris, the angel of the covenant, Hinei shelach lefonecha, behold, yours is before you. And then we say, Amoid al yamini samcheni, stand on my right and support me. So there is this Shalshavsky, he has a problem with this language because we shouldn't be praying to Malachim, to angels. That's possibly also, colored by the Malach, the Maskilim having a problem with anything which they don't really see with their eyes. As we know, even the story with Shimon of Zamut, which is also a town in the Litter. Shimon of Zamut comes to Ladi or Liozna, and he meets the Alter Rebbe. I think it's to Tov Kuf Nun Beis. And the Alter Rebbe asks him about how does he teach the children about when Yitzchok finds out that Yaakov has taken the brachas and how the Gehenna opens up under his feet, and he says he doesn't want to tell the children frightening things, and the Alter Rebbe kind of sussed him out. But this is typical for Maskilim. But that was his problem. But he professes he has a problem. How can we pray and make an offering to Eliyahu as a malach? So the response is written by someone by the name of he signs his name as Sar Ho Adulomi. So I did some research last night. He was a scholar, more scholar than a Talmud Chochem, as in more like in language, that kind of stuff. His son wrote a sefer which is very popular in the Litvish yeshivas called Marcheshes. But the father was a little bit kind of, so he used his scholarliness to rebut the the maskilim. So he fought them on their territory, so to speak. So he says that there's this. He explains what's being said over here at the bris. So he explains at length. This, as I say, it's about 140 years ago, 160 years ago. He explains at length how in Jewish communities there would be at the back of the shul, there would be a small passage, a small doorway, and that was called the Mila tier, and that was where the baby boy would be brought in for the bris, and the kavaterin would come to the door on that small door on the outside, and the kvater would be on the inside and take the baby in to the bris. On the back wall, they would have a special chair. It was a double-seated chair, well padded, and it was designated for Kiseh Shel Eliyohu. That would be normally suspended on hooks on the western wall, on the back of the shul. When a bris would be taking place, so the shamus would take this chair off the suspended hooks, and he would bring it into the middle of the shul where the bris is going to be held, take place, and the people would stand around. So it says in the Zohar that's important not only to have a chair for Eliyahu, but it's important to say, to designate this is the chair for Eliyahu. And this Zohar is quoted in the Shulchan Aruch that it's important to designate the chair orally. So what he says is, it is this the shamus who says this first phrase, that's the shamus piece. Then the moyel starts gearing up for his work, and he says, he realizes that it's a risky thing which is undertaking to do. So he says, "Lishuoscha kivisi Hashem, please Hashem protect me. Sibarti lishuoscha Hashem, missing the letter Hey for Hashem. I'm hoping for your salvation. Or mitzvah asisi, and I'm doing your mitzvahs." So he's going to carry out the mitzvah of the bris. Therefore, he says, "Sibarti lishuoscha Hashem, mitzvah asisi." Now the sandik comes over. And he's told, you have to sit at this seat. There's two padded seats, one next to the other. And the sandik is obviously uncomfortable to sit on the seat of Eliyahu. So remember, it says there's two seats there. One is for Eliyahu, one is for him. So Eliyahu malach bris, hine shaloch lefonecho. He says I'm addressing Eliyahu, I know you're present here. Here is your chair. I'm not sitting in your chair. I'm sitting next to you. Then the moil turns to the father, who's trembling at the side. He says, well, actually, come over and stand next to me. Amoid al yamini. The father is called by the moil to stand right next to him. V'somcheni, and to empower me. V'losham smicha, endorse me. Give me, and as you see many times, the moil will say to the father, make me a shliach. So this is what this is saying. Amoid al yamini v'somcheni is not an appeal to Eliyahu haNovi to support the moil, but rather it's calling the father to stand next to the moil and to empower the moil. Then the sibarti lishuoscha Hashem. Now the father is now standing, and as I said, in trepidation. So he again says sibarti lishuoscha Hashem. Now this pasuk is not in Nusach Chabad, not in the Alter Rebbe's Nusach, but in other Nusachos, this pasuk is said again. But the first time, as you can see, it's the full pasuk. Sibarti lishuoscha Hashem u'mitzvosecha asisi. That's said by the moil because he's going to carry out the mitzvah. The father is not doing the mitzvah personally. Therefore, he just says, I'm hoping Hashem, I'm hoping for your salvation. Then that's his trepidation. Then he switches to the positive, and he says, I'm rejoicing for your statement, as one who's found a great spoil, a great fortune. So his prayer and his simcha are doing the bris. The kohol respond, and they say two psukim in reference to the anxiety of the father. the community, the congregation present say, Shalom l'rov lo yaveis yasecha. Great peace for those who love your Torah. Ve'ein lo michshel, and they will not be stumbling. So you're worried about a mistake happening. So ein lo michshel, it'll be okay. And the fact that you are rejoicing that you are bringing your child into the covenant of Avraham, indeed, Asher tivchas korev, happy is the one who's chosen and can be brought closer and come closer to Hashem's home. So this is how this Sar Ha'adulomi, how this he rebuts the concern, and he explains at length what happened. That originally, this was all done. It was people knew each one knew what to say, and he says that perhaps it was embroidered on the padding of the chair. This was embroidered. And he did not say who says what. And when the printers later came in the advent of printing, they didn't realize that these are psukim said by different people, and therefore they put them all in one stretch, and they're all said together. All right, it's interesting explanation. Now, just a couple of points here. One is that actually in the Zohar it says that the Moihol, as far as I remember, the Moil says, Ashrei tivchas korev yishkein chatzirecho, and then the Kohol say, Nizba'o b'tuv beisecho k'dei chalecho. In some Sidurim and in some Minhagim, that is observed to this day. In our Siddur, there's no distinction, which is interesting. And that's one point. The other point is, I want to say that I remember as a child that my father would use, although Shalom was a Moil, and there would always be two chairs for the Sandik, and for the Sandik and for Eliyahu, two separate chairs. And then at some stage this changed, and that was because a letter of the Rebbe from winter Tofshin Yud Aleph, 1951. Well, around then the Rebbe says that he remembers he was at a bris in Warsaw, and the Moyol was a Polisher, and as far as he remembers that there was one chair. Okay, now, just about 17 years ago, Yeshua Monshein, Alav Shalom, my cousin, sent me, that was when my first grandson was born, and he sent me something which he found in my grandfather's files, in his archives. My grandfather, Akiv Yosef, was a Moyel in Eretz Yisrael, and in Iyar, Tofshin Yud Aleph, about 3 months after that letter of the Rebbe, my uncle David, who was a bochel in New York, he writes to my Zayda in Eretz Yisrael that today there was a bris by a grandson of Eliyahu, that's Rabbi Rosenfeld, who runs the seminary in Sfas. He was born then, and the Rebbe was the Sandik, and the Moyel wanted to use one chair, and the Rebbe said to use two chairs, because that's how it's mashma, as far as I remember in the Shul or something. I can look it up. But the Rebbe, in other words, contrary to what the Rebbe had written a few months earlier, that he's more inclined to say that it should be one chair. But the Rebbe himself, when he was sounding, he says there should be two chairs. So that's I would, when someone asks me, I tell them to use two chairs. Now, what I know that Rebbe Eli Landau, who lives in Bnei Brak and is active Moyel, as well as many other wonderful things. So his take on this is to have two chairs, but then to cover them with a blanket or something, in that way that the two chairs are kind of connected as one. Which now, having read this whole article from 140 years ago, 160 years ago, describing the Kisa Shel Eliyahu as it was common in Lita, in Belarus, etc., to have a double-seated chair and two separate pads to separate, one for Eliyahu and one for the Sandik. So it kind of ties in. So if you don't have a special Kisa Shel Eliyahu, but then to have two chairs and one chair kind of in one. All right, so enough discussion of that for the moment. I'm sure we'll get some feedback on that. But, okay. Let's move on. So someone was asking, one of our listeners in the United States, is asking about walking in front of a sensor, which is going to switch lights on. And now it's very common in buildings, apartment buildings, that they have lights which go on as you go in and out. And what's the story for Shabbos? So what you have on the screen is from Rav Padve, Rov of Anash, and from Rav Osner. But they're not talking about lights in buildings. They're talking about lights on the street, where someone would put up a light sensor as a deterrent for thieves. And when you pass and walk in the street, then you sometimes activate those lights. And that's what they are addressing here. So he writes here, this is, I'll read Rav Osner, they both say similar stuff. If you're just walking innocently, and you're not as if you're doing anything in order to cause a malacha to happen, and it just happens, so long as you have no intention to go to this point in order to activate the light, then that's not called a malacha. And he says it's not a malacha at all. Okay. And don't compare this to doors which are activated by sensors with an electric eye, because there, of course, you want the consequence, you want the result, and that the door should open for you, and that's not allowed. Here, you're just walking on your merry way, and there's a sensor which is picking up. You have no interest in it at all, so that's okay. And again, I think he does say, well, that's talking about where you have no, he doesn't say here necessarily where you have no option. I think Rav Hadva does say that. If it's difficult for you to avoid using that route, then you are allowed to use that route. So that's the basic position, that if that's the only route you can get to or from your destination or your home, etc., then you're allowed to pass by, so long as you don't. Now, having said that, I've been asked this question several times. What about someone who wants to buy or rent a place in a building? And in that building, there are sensors. So he asks, is it okay for me to move into this building where I'm going to have to be activating sensors every Shabbos? So it's certainly not lechatchila. It's not an advisable setup. Problem is that that, like we all know, sometimes it's very difficult to find accommodation in bigger cities. It's very difficult to find something. So it's not a lechatchila. Then inside going inside the corridor, to say that I don't care for the light going on or not, well, I actually had the experience. I was somewhere in Switzerland, in someone's in an apartment building, and there it wasn't with sensors, it was with push buttons. By every floor, there's a button to push to activate. And I walked down the stairs in pitch black, and I missed a stair, fell over. Baruch Hashem, I survived, but it was dangerous, yeah. And so a little bit of light is actually very important to have. So to say I don't need the light is not really true. You do need that light. So if there is in the corridor minimal security lights, there's like a small glow, and then when you pass by, then activates the bigger light. So as far as safety is concerned, your safety concerns are addressed already by the minimal light. The comfort, the extra light was okay. That can be ignored. You can see I don't need it. But if it's pitch black, so then what happens if Itaka is pitch black? There is no extra security light. So sometimes people in such a situation, I've advised them to put up their own battery-operated lantern out in the corridor, if possible. In that way, they have a minimal amount of light, and then they can ignore the sensors going on. I've also been told, this I haven't checked out myself, that if you walk very slowly then it's not going to activate the sensors. But that I haven't checked out. Someone's telling me that the chief rabbi was staying in Buckingham Palace last Shabbos. They provided a servant to walk in front of him to trigger the lights. Okay. Fine. Yeah, very well. Let's move on. Let's move on. There's a separate discussion about using electric keys, which you touch a pad and it opens the door. These electronic pads, that's more complicated because they're mamish. On the other hand, there's no fire happening. I remember once we had a conversation with Rav Padver, Rav Ephraim, and he was trying to be mati with a kalachayad. No. Let's move on. So someone this week asks me, can you give me a little bit of background about the difference in the way we wrap our tefillin as a wrap around the arm, where there's a difference between Ashkenaz and Sfard, Chassidim, etc. Interesting, the Ger Chassidim, they keep to the Ashkenaz minhag of turning their tzuas inwards rather than minhag Sfard, which is turning the tzuas outwards. So this is you have in the Mishnah Brura in Simon Chof Zayin. The Alter Rebbe doesn't even address this, as far as I can see. But meanwhile, he says that the Rabbi Yaakov ben Chaviv, who was the Rebbe of the Bris Yosef, he says that the kesher needs to be on the inside of the tefillin, closer to the heart. But where the ritzuah goes into the loop, that is beyond, like further away from the heart, and that's the Sfard style, that you've got the loop is where the ritzuah goes through is on the far side, so to speak, of the tefillin, and then they do what we call a U-turn and pull it down, and as a result, they are rotating the straps outwards. The Darkei Moshe says it's actually better that the loop where the tefillin strap goes through is going to be also on the inside near the heart, along with the kesher. So that, and that he also quotes the Halochos Gdolos, that the tying should be close to the heart. And also it gives another reference. So we've got here two methods, whether the loop is on the far side or the loop is on the inside. Well, the advantage of the Sfard style is that the yud, as in the kesher, the knot of the shalyad, because it's being pulled, the pull is away from the body, so that's pulling the knot towards the box of the tefillin. And it's very strong language in the Zohar that the yud of the knot should not be separated from the box of the tefillin. So the Sfard style is pulling the knot closer to the box. The Ashkenaz style has the advantage that the tightening is closer to the heart. Okay, so these are the two sides of it. Now, in Chabad style, we have both advantages together because we have the knot is on the inside, and we tighten it there. So we have, and then we work outwards. So we're tightening as we we make the first shin on the arm, we're actually tightening the kesher, the yud, to the bias. I have seen Ashkenaz tefillin where the sofer has made with a gid, with a sinew, he made a string to tie the knot to the bias, because otherwise it would be pulling away. So these are advantages for either way. There's another aspect here, which Meforshim say that we have a style in halacha that whenever you turn, you should turn to the right. So when you are, relevant to Chanukah, etc. So when you are turning the tefillin inwards, so you are actually turning from the left to the right, from your left arm towards your right. Whereas if you're going outwards, you're going from the right to the left. Then he quotes here from the Kutei Mahariach. But actually, when we write Hebrew, we are starting from the right of the page, and we're writing, moving towards the left of the page. And since tefillin, we have ukashartom ukasavtom, that the tying of the tefillin is compared to the writing. So since in writing you go from right to left, therefore it's also okay for the tying to go from the right to left. But then, so here you're seeing the different views. And as I said, the meaning asfardim is to tie outwards, and ger, in this respect, in this aspect, they have clung to the minig Ashkenaz. Someone is saying here that Reb Shlomo Zalman said, he probably means Shlomo Chaim. Someone said that the Farbrengen that Misnagdim wrap inwards towards themselves, and Mechsidim wrap out, thinking about someone else. That's why you're wrapping outwards. Yeah, I've heard that before. That's obviously more al derech hatzachos, but here we're talking about in a halacha. So this is the background, the advantage of making the tightening closer in. That's the advantage of Ashkenaz, and Chabad also have that. The advantage of Menusach Sfard is that you are pulling the knot to be touching the bias. And again, that you have, so in Chabad style, you're actually having the best of both. Not only in this, in many things, but fine. Let's move on. So someone asked me about piercing a carton or a sachet. Well, you can see the sachets over here of a drink, and it's made of a thicker plastic, but there's a particular point where the plastic has got a hole, and inside there's a bit of silver foil, probably also a little bit of plastic also, but much thinner, and it comes along with a straw, if they still exist in the British Isles, and you better push it through. And so, this is also true with the small cartons, like the mini orange juices, etc., apple juices. So are you allowed to open those on Shabbos to put now to explain what the shaila is here? There's a Mishnah in Shabbos, and it talks about a barrel which has got dates, and it says shreiver odom chovis. A person is allowed to break open this barrel in order to, he wants to say to his guests, come and enjoy the stuff inside. He shouldn't have intention to make a neat opening. So that's the idea that you shouldn't be making a neat opening. And that's why, for example, to tear open, where the cartons, the bigger cartons, where the more, should I say, unsophisticated ones, it says you should pick up the fold over, and then it has a dotted line. It says tear here along this dotted line. Well, to do that on Shabbos is not okay, because you are making a neat opening. And I'm sure you have had the experience of a messy opening, and then that's a segula for having orange juice all over the tablecloth. So making a neat opening would not be okay. That's the Mishnah says. So here, this is the kind of the question: is this considered making a neat opening? And here we have from Rav Forkash, he's got published 4 Sforim on Hilchos Shabbos, and the 4th volume has a whole chapter about opening containers, etc., etc. And so he writes the following: there are drink cartons, and they have a hole, and it has silver foil. And when you want to drink, you pierce the silver foil with a straw or something. So he says you are allowed to do so on Shabbos. And then he goes, all right, he talks about other things, but fine. So Rav Forkash says it is okay, and I guess he's taking the view that this is not a neat opening. And all right, so there you have a heter, fine. The common question is about dishwashers. When you find the utensils of one type in the other side, it's milchig in the fleshig in the milchig. Now, I know that there's soap in the dishwasher, but apparently the first couple of minutes there is a stream of boiling hot water without soap, and that's where I'm worried. So again, many times people ask me to mix up in the sink, and my first question to them is, did you use washing up soap? And If that's the case, then I can relax because there's a concept called tam pogum, moisen tam lifgam, a taste which is tainted, does not make, with an unpleasant taste, does not make things strafe. Therefore, dishes which are mixed up in a bowl of hot water with soap is not such a problem. B'diavad. We're not recommending this, we're talking about b'diavad. It's not doesn't make a trade. The problem here is that, let's say you had a knife which had been used for cutting pizza and it's got cheese on it, and next to it there's a spoon which was used for gravy, and they're both next to one another, and then there's a hot shower which makes a shidduch between the two. That's where the problem is. Right. So what I have here on the screen is for a sefer called Pesukim Utshuvos. Now I've mentioned many times Piskei Tshuvos, and that's on Orach Chaim, and his son-in-law has done a similar kind of work on Yeridea, several sections, and just the last few years, very useful. And he writes the following: if fleishika milchika dishes were washed in the dishwasher one after the other, ask a shaila, generally it's not a problem. If you had meat and milky dishes washed up in the same time, and there wasn't 60 times in the water against the kalim, then they should have hagala. But he says, if they are kalim which cannot be kashed with the boiling water, like porcelain, I'm in the middle of the shiur now. So then you can be makel that the kalim did not become asur. So again, if it's cutlery, so the recommendation would be to kasher. If a fleshika knife was found in the milchika dishwasher, so all right, kasher it, no big loss. If it's porcelain or china or whatever which cannot be kashered, then we're going to rely on various arguments to say that perhaps because of the soap, perhaps because of the that it's klisheni, whatever. There's going to be various cheshbonos that b'diavad it's going to be okay. Right. Let's move on. So someone asks me, does a married man in Chabad make a bracha on the talis cotton? So before I got married, I would had a talis cotton. I would switch it in the morning and make a bracha on the talis cotton. But once I got married, so then I would make a bracha on the talis every morning, and I didn't make a bracha on the smaller tzitzis, on the talis cotton, because I'm making a bracha on the talis. To explain a little bit more, the nusach habracha we've got in the Tilas Hashem Siddur, we've got a nusach habracha al mitzvah tzitzis and a bracha lehisateh b'tzitzis. In the original Alter Rebbe's Siddur, it does not have the bracha al mitzvah tzitzis. There's no bracha for talis cotton, and this goes back actually hundreds of years earlier, where the Rabbi Yosef Karo, he doesn't have a bracha of al mitzvah tzitzis. In the Gemara, there's a bracha lehisateh b'tzitzis, and to the point that there are go'inim who say, "Aha, you see, you have to do atifo, and that's why when we put on the talis, we wrap around." But this nusach bracha of al mitzvah tzitzis did not mention the Gemara. It's first mentioned about perhaps 700 years ago, whatever. It's a relatively recent innovation. So when you have no option, because you're not going to do wrapping because your talis cotton is too small to wrap, so then what's mentioned hayom yom, so then you'd make a bracha al mitzvah tzitzis. But if you are going to make the bracha lehisateh b'tzitzis, so then include the talis cotton with your bracha on your talis cotton. So I mentioned this before, I think, on this shiur, that on Friday afternoon, I go to mikveh, so I take with a change of clothing, and I take with a talis cotton, especially for Shabbos. Like everything else is changed for Shabbos, so the talis cotton is also a special one for Shabbos. And I'm not going to wear a talis afterwards, So then on Friday afternoon, I can make a bracha on the new talis cotton, and make a bracha on mitzvah tzitzis. But other than that, I don't. And this is my understanding, but there are those who have disputed this. And they're saying that where you read in Hayom Yom, it's only talking about if you had to daven, put on your talis right away, but if it's a long interval between putting on the tzitzis in the morning, you should make a bracha on the tzitzis. Okay, so now I'm going to read here. Someone sent to me this article, this piece from the article in Kfar Chabad. This is talking about the late Rav Chadakov, and where he goes into Yechidus to the Frierdiker Rebbe just before his chasana. And one of the things discussed in Yechidus was about wearing a talis cotton when sleeping. So Chadakov says to the Rebbe, it's now several years that he's accustomed to wear a talis cotton when he's sleeping. Now, just bear in mind, Rabbi Chadakov was not from a Chabad background, and therefore, whereas Chassidim wear talis cotton when they're sleeping, it's not so common by non-Chassidim, and therefore that was, I guess, part of the discussion. And Rabbi Chadakov is saying that it's now several years that he wears a talis cotton when he goes to sleep. The Rebbe asks him, what do you do about a bracha? So Rabbi Chadakov answered that I don't make a bracha, I guess because he was using the same tzitzis day and night, and therefore it's not a new garment, so you can't make a bracha. So the Rebbe says to him, Shehaminig etzloi, the minig which means that by his minig is to remove before sleeping, to remove the talis cotton of the daytime and to sleep with another one, a nighttime one. In order that you shouldn't have a dilemma whether to make a bracha in the morning. And the reason why you wear talis cotton at night is not to be naked without a mitzvah of tzitzis. Now, this is how it's written in Kfar Chabad. Now, if you read this article, you get the impression that the Rebbe is saying to him that his minig is to change his talis cotton every night, to switch over for a night and for a day. Now, the same article is written in a shiur, like a diary which was published by the Chadakov family for a family wedding going back 22 years ago. And it's published, it's called Ateres Kainim, and it has the same Yechidus. Now let's read this in the other version. I told the Rebbe that it's been several years, many years, that I've been sleeping with a talis cotton. The Rebbe asked me, what do I do about the bracha on the talis cotton? So I said, I don't make a bracha. So he said to me, Etzlom hoyunoy hagin. By them, they used to have the custom to switch the talis cotton by night for a different one. Now, there's just very minor change here. Etzlom hoyunoy hagin, or haminig etzloihu. They seem to be minimal, but it's very different wording. One is saying his personal minig, the other one is saying this was our custom. You are a bocher before you're married, and when I was a bocher, the minig which we had, in Chabad, back in Lubavitch, was that they switch the talis cotton for night. So just those words are slightly different, and so at Shlomo Yonogi, that does not mean that Ingeman has to switch his talis cotton every night, and I can still remain with the minig of Ingeman. Once he's making a bracha on talis gadol, he doesn't have this worry that he can make a bracha on talis cotton. Someone is clarifying, Rabbeinu, I think. Rabbi Chadakov was born in Beshenkovich. His father was a chassid, but his chinuch was not Chabad, because the father's company relocated him to Latvia. Okay, so he was brought up in Latvia, and therefore he didn't necessarily, it wasn't a given that he would be wearing a talis cotton when sleeping. Okay, so that's a bit of clarification on that. Let's move on. So here on Friday, someone's asking me, his wife is going to stay overnight in hospital with a child. And so she's able to go in and out. The question is, what does she do about Neiras Shabbos? So she's asking, perhaps she should light at home and then get into the car and then come to Shul. And light on home al Tanai, not Mekabel Shabbos. She can light at a friend who lives near the hospital. She can ask someone to light candles for her in another house, asking whether any of those things are advisable. So now, let's read this first of all. And this is based upon a Lashon Gemara about lighting candles on Erev Shabbos. Not to light too early and not to light too late. So not to light too early. If you're going to light too early, so then it's not evident that you're lighting the covered Shabbos. Obviously, lighting too late is risking Chilul Shabbos. If you do want to light early, and you want to be Mekabel Shabbos, then that's okay. Because you are Mekabel Shabbos right away, that's not called lahaktim. Again, if you're lighting early, and he said, provided it's after Plag HaMincha, so you can light early if you have Mekabel Shabbos. So then your lighting is associated with the Kabbalah Shabbos. But if you're going to light candles and then you're going to go and continue doing the laundry, whatever it may be, so then that's what the Gemara says, lo yaktim. Don't do it too early because you're not ready to be in Kabbalah Shabbos. And that's in Sivor, but later Siv Zayin, the Alter Rebbe goes back to this and he says, the Divrei HaKoil, Sorech Sheyakabel Shabbos, la'alter acha ha'adloka. Lighting, even though you can light in circumstances where the condition not to accept Shabbos, but it has to be that shortly thereafter, you're going to be Mekabel Shabbos. You're going to cease from Loch, either yourself or someone else in the family. Someone is going to accept Shabbos shortly after this lighting. So if this woman wants to, for her to go into the car after lighting, not be Mekabel Shabbos, well, yes, if someone's going to stay home and be Mekabel Shabbos, as a result, that would be a possibility. But if there's no one Mekabel Shabbos, so for her to get into the car and it's going to be 20 minutes drive, then she cannot light Shabbos candles at home. Now, how long is Alter? So the Alter Rebbe in the Kuntras Achron has Harbe Pochos Mireva Shor, much less than a quarter of an hour, and Chaim Noah says approximately 10 minutes. So that's the general guidance. If you want to be Mekabel, if you want to light candles and not Mekabel Shabbos, because you want to get into the car or something, if it's 10 minutes or less between from here to your destination, that would be okay, but it's significantly longer, then that would not be an option. Now, then the other option about lighting at another home. So what's the point of going to another home and lighting? It's keilu, as if you're saying I have to give an offering of candles for Shabbos. There's no offering here. It's not a korban. It's a din of lighting up and giving an atmosphere to the place which you're going to be for Shabbos. So lighting in someone else's house and going away doesn't really make sense to me. And certainly to ask, someone, can you light some extra candles in your house because I'm in the hospital? It doesn't have any that doesn't make any sense to me. What I said is make a bracha on the electric. You're going to be with your child in the hospital before Shabbos, you'll switch on the electric lights and you can make a bracha on the electric lights. Generally, of course, that's not the recommended thing. We do to keep to the traditional lights, but if there's no option other than lighting, there's no other option of lighting a naked flame, so then you can make a bracha on an electric light. I mentioned this before, that Reb Zalman Shimon himself, when he was in hospital, so he made a bracha on the fluorescent light, which is next to his bed, and he says that to other people, and he did so himself too. Let's move on. So here's a question about a man lighting Shabbos candles. So someone's asking, is there a point in him covering his eyes when he lights the candles? So why is, and at first I think, it's not imperative for a man to be Mekabel Shabbos, but really what's the reason for covering the eyes when saying the bracha? So the explanation is basically that normally a bracha is said before the act of the mitzvah is done. And that's the Sfardim, indeed, they make the bracha before lighting the Shabbos candles. The Ashkenazim have they're anxious that the bracha is a kind of declaration of the Kabbalah's Shabbos, so therefore they leave the bracha for after the lighting. But on the other hand, how do you accommodate that the bracha is before the act? So the explanation is that benefiting from the light, that's the main thing, not the act of lighting, but the appreciating the light. So they they light it and cover their eyes, make the bracha, and then open the eyes. Oh, it's light, and appreciate the light. That is the explanation of why Minig Ashkenaz is to cover the eyes and for saying the bracha. Now, if that's the case, if a man is lighting and he's making the bracha after having lit, so it's the same thing. He wants to make it a bracha that overlaps the yoson. And once it's done and the lights are open, what's he making a bracha on? So he covers his eyes. Now, but the more, how do you say, basic question, is it imperative for a man to make the bracha after the lighting like a woman does, since this idea that Kabbalah Shabbos comes along with the bracha? But men are not necessarily Mekabel Shabbos. This is a woman's thing, she's Mekabel Shabbos with the bracha. But a men's thing is possibly because men go to Shul, etc. It could be whatever the explanation is. But it's not imperative that a man's Mekabel Shabbos with lighting. So why shouldn't a man be making the bracha before? Make the bracha, and then you light it and finish. So now Reb Chaim Noah, he's reading into the Alter Rebbe that a man should also make the bracha after lighting, like a woman. What I have on the screen here is from Reb Nissen David Dubov's book on candle lighting, but actually this is the same in various recent Chabad works, where they have the same reservation. It's not so evident that the Alter Rebbe holds, because when the Alter Rebbe says about this minig of making the bracha after lighting, he switches to the feminine, and it possibly is just talking about the minig of women, but not necessarily in the case of men. So I gave this over on Friday night, and someone asked, "What would you do?" Therefore, I was in that position. So I said I would actually say the bracha after lighting, and I'll tell you why. The late Rav Ashkenazi took the view that whilst you can light candles for Shabbos on condition or not to accept, but if you say halachic nesha Shabbos kodesh, you add the word kodesh. Kodesh is the expression of Kabbalah Shabbos, and once you say halachic Shabbos kodesh, it doesn't help to make a condition. That was his approach, and therefore, if I'm going to use the Chabad nusach of halachic nesha Shabbos kodesh, then I would do all malacha before and be Mekabel Shabbos do. Which is also an interesting ha'ora. What about if there is a case where someone wants to get light al tanai and then get into the car? Then perhaps they should be keeping to the Veltishnus, just in halachic nesha Shabbos, and not add the word kodesh because of this word of Rav Ashkenazi. Possibly, I did not look it up recently. Possibly in this forum Sharit Philo Minik, possibly he addresses this in detail. Right. We have now just 2 points left, and one is first the fact, we had a discussion of why is of Zion said at Mincha on Shabbos. So Reb Meir Zirkin brought to my attention there's a sefer called Tanya Rabsi or Tanya Rabossi. It's one of the late Rishonim, and about tefillah, etc. And he says it used to be that after davening there would be a shiur, people would learn Nevi'im, etc., and then they would learn Mishnah and Talmud. And then when poverty became more rampant and people couldn't afford to spend so long after Shmoneh Esrei to start learning Torah for such a long time, so therefore they kind of made a minimum. You know what? We'll just say 2 psukim of Zion v'ani zois brisi, which is like a little bit of a reading a bit of Torah. And so that was like the mini shiur after Shmoneh Esrei. Now, on Shabbos and Yom Tov, where people are not going to work, well, then we can keep to the learning Torah. We have a whole Kriyas HaTorah. And Kriyas HaTorah, as you know, used to be translated into Aramaic. between each pasuk. Now, you might take manim still that unto today, and therefore this is the point which I found so interesting. We don't need to do a volat tziyun at Shachris and Shabbos and Yom Tov. The volat tziyun is to make up for the shiur, but we've got the shiur, we've got Kriyas HaTorah, so we don't have to say two psukim. We've got a whole Kriyas HaTorah. So that's why a volat tziyun is not said at Shachris and Yom Tov and Shabbos and Yom Tov, because you have a whole Kriyas HaTorah. Therefore, instead, but it's said at Mincha. It's said at Mincha because not to miss it out altogether. Now, he points out also, Rav Meir pointed out, that on Yom Kippur, we don't say a volat tziyun at Mincha. Whenever we have a haftorah, we won't say a volat tziyun then. Because if the idea of haftorah is to read psukim from Novi, so then when you're doing an actual haftorah, you don't have to say a volat tziyun. So indeed, at Mincha on Yom Kippur, we don't say volat tziyun. Instead, we have it at Ne'ilah, which I find a very interesting ha'ara. Coming back to the previous thing, if a man lights, does he cover his eyes? So again, if you're going to first light and then say the bracha, then you should cover your eyes. If you're going to first say the bracha and then light, then you don't need to cover your eyes. And I'm more inclined to say that you do it just like you saw your mother doing and your wife doing, etc. That you light and then you say the bracha. That's what Reb Chaim says, and, although there are arguments the other way around. One last thing, and that is, we had our discussion about Suda Shlishis, is the Rebbe's Farbrengen, Suda Shlishis or Suda Shnio, etc. So Rabbi Yisrael Noach Vogel was an old classmate of mine. He heard the recording. He says he looked up his diaries, from the Rebbe's Farbrengens, and Shabbos B'Shalach Tov Shin Mem Vov. There were many bottles of mashke which the Rebbe gave out to people, and when the Rebbe finished giving out to everyone, and by the way, I underline the word b'shalach because that's where the parsha where we talk about the mon talks about. That's the basis of the sort of shlishis. At any rate, the Rebbe finished. Then he finished his cup, which is all filled with Smirnoff, and after the Rebbe had his drink, a full cup of Smirnoff, then he started coughing a lot, and people felt very uncomfortable. What can they do? And the Rebbe told Rabbi Mentelik to fill up his cup with wine, and everyone's looking. And then the Rebbe turns to Rabbi Yoel Khan and tells him no, and he says, and at that point the Rebbe had the glass of wine, finished the cup of wine, and then more or less finished the coughing, calmed down. And it came to the last bit of the niggin of Bnei Chola. They were thinking of singing it over again. So the Rebbe indicated with his hand they should sing it over again, and they sang it with chayes. Okay, that's the story of Shalach Tov Shin Mem Vov. I'm not sure whether that's when I was there. At any rate, then Reb Mendy Wilhelm was in a shliach he's a shliach in Uzhgorod, Ungvar in Lithuania, in Ukraine. His wife is Paris from here, from Stamford Hill. So he says there was he's a bit of it back, another information. There was a yid from Yerushalayim, not a chassid. For some reason, he had to be in Crown Heights for that Shabbos, B'Shalach Tov Shin Mem Vov. He was curious. He was keen. Where can you have a Shabbos meal? Most people wouldn't eat a Shabbos meal because they're going to those Farbrengen. They sorted out they should go by someone who have a meal by someone who eats the Shabbos meal before the Farbrengen. But then he had a problem with the Shlishis. He told him, we can't help you. After the Farbrengen, they said to him, you see, in your marriage, there was a mini sort of shlishis because the Rebbe had an extra cup of wine, and he told him to sing Bnei Chola. Obviously, it was to be to you, they should have the sort of shlishis. He then, Rabbi Yisrael Noach, sent a message to a certain group. I just find it fascinating how these people are, or who know all this information. Do you remember when the Rebbe had sang Bnei Chola at the Farbrengen? Besides your Kislef Tavshin Design, and Chov Dal Teves Tavshin Chov Gimel. And so Rabbi Meir Zelikson says it was several times the Rebbe left the Farbrengen as they were singing this niggin. Tzemach Notik writes, Shabbos Breishis, the Rebbe put in his glasses, and they're singing their Chola, also Shabbos Tshuva, the second Farbrengen, and Simchas Torah, Shabbos Breishis, Tovshin and Dalet. All right, and then Yosel Librov says Shabbos Mishpotim Tovshin Mem Ches. That's the week after the Rebbetzin passed away, and I was there for that Shabbos. Perhaps it was that Shabbos I was there. And then Michael Zelikson says Hazinu, Shabbos Tovshin Chav Zayin, it was a Hazinu, and that Shabbos Tshuva, Shabbos Breishis, Kedoshim, Aloischa, and Tovshin Lamed Aleph in Parshas Tiso, and in Vayelech Tovshin Lamed Beis, and many other times. And Yossi Lu says it wasn't in Parsha in Yeri of Tismach. So listen, it was all on Shabbos, so there's no recording. So whatever. I found it fascinating how people have got this record of all the details of when it was, but it was apparently not so rare. But okay. All right, I hope you enjoyed that, and I'll wish you all a good night, and we should have B'suras Tevis Kotel. Thank you.